Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I sometimes wonder how many of you regular listeners have glommed on to some of my habits. I am not the most organized fella in the world, and so putting together these podcasts every day and sending them out is not the easiest thing I've ever done. But one of the ways I try to make it easier for me is to try to follow a particular pattern. You should know that typically on a Thursday or a Friday, that's when we're going to have our appeal segment. We're going to have our ism on Tuesday. Typically, we have Curating Your Movie Library on Friday and Curating Your Book Library on Wednesday. Well, today is Wednesday, and we are doing a Curating Your Book Library. But I also like to try to change things up a little bit from time to time so you don't get too bored with what we're doing. And so for today, as we're coming to the end of the year, we're going to do a Curating Your Book Library where I don't just talk about one book, but I'm going to give you a list of 10 books that I would strongly recommend that you read in the coming year. These are not the top 10 books ever. They're not the top 10 books of 2020. They're just 10 books that I think would be really helpful for the vast majority of what I perceive to be my general listener to this podcast. So we're going to have to go through them pretty quickly to get this to fit in. It's not going to be, by the way, one segment. It's going to be one episode. So we have a little bit more time than we might otherwise have. I'm going to tell you the name of the book, the author of the book, and a little bit about why I think it would be helpful for you to give this book a read. Now, some more broad guidelines that apply to all of these books. None of them are especially difficult books. One of them is probably higher on the list of difficulty than the rest, maybe one or two, but not any of them are especially difficult books. My picking of these books is essentially one and a half goals here. The first goal is that I want you to learn something. The other part of the goal is I want you to be moved by what you learn. And that means that the things that we're learning about need to be things that should be moving to us. In addition to that, we're hoping that the writers have sufficient skill that they won't kill the wonder of the thing that they're talking about. All right, enough of this background. Let's get to our list. Number 1, A Christian View of Man and Things. I have done a Curating Your Book Library on this book and probably most of the books, if not all of them, on this list. This is written by Dr. Gordon Clark, who was the preeminent Christian philosopher of the 20th century, who taught most of his career not far from where I am in Butler University in Butler, Indiana, but later in his life taught at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain. And this book is just the bomb. I would put on this list Thales to Dewey, Gordon Clark's outstanding survey of the history of philosophy. But A Christian View of Man and Things is just a little bit more personal, a little less textbooky, and again, filled with a sense of wonder, or at least it should drive us to a sense of wonder. A Christian View of Man and Things. I should tell you this. When I was a student at Reformed Theological Seminary, and I had my Intro to Philosophy class with the rest of the students there, my professor was Dr. R.C. Sproul, and he assigned Gordon Clark's Thales to Dewey to the class. And as he was going over the syllabus and gave that assignment to the class, he stopped and he looked at me and he said, "You also will need to read A Christian View of Man and Things. That is you, singular. He was looking at me. I had the additional book on my assignment list. So there's that book, A Christian View of Man and Things by Gordon Clark. Second on the list is a book that I talk about a lot because it's meant so much to me, and it is relatively recent. The book is called The Whole Christ. It's written by Dr. Sinclair Ferguson, who is a deep, deep, deep hero to me. Just precisely the kind of marriage of a moved spirit and an informed mind that I aspire to have and would love to see among God's people across the board. The Whole Christ is an exploration of, an unpacking of the reality of God's love for us, and I commend it to you with great, great vigor. This book is probably the book I've recommended more than any other book over the last 3 or 4 years. Close to that would be Sinclair's Children of the Living God, another short, brief book, this one on the biblical doctrine of adoption. It's also just mind-blowing. These two books by Sinclair are both in my top 20 of all-time books I've ever read. Number 3, The Everlasting Man. The Everlasting Man is one of the more well-known, not top of the list, but maybe middle of the list of well-known works by G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was a journalist and a poet and a novelist and a man of letters at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. He is, in my judgment, probably the most gifted writer I've ever read. And he was to C.S. Lewis his C.S. Lewis. That is, he was the inspiration, and you can see it just shining through. And The Everlasting Man, the reason I chose this one is because it is its scope and its sweep. It really is Chesterton essentially unpacking the glorious truth that Jesus serves as the second Adam. Now, be forewarned, Chesterton is not a good theologian. He's a bad theologian, but he nevertheless has great insight into the Bible as a story. Not that he doesn't believe that it's true. He does believe that it's true, but he has an insight and a perspective that is really, really helpful. And so I commend The Everlasting Man to you. If you are looking for Chesterton and don't want to start with something that ambitious, let me commend to you his book Orthodoxy as well, which is just amazing, both of which, again, would be in my top 20 ever. Number 4, speaking of being C.S. Lewis to C.S. Lewis, it's time for the obligatory C.S. Lewis book, and I actually have one written down and then crossed out and replaced with another, partly because I'm wanting to again, see this as a help to the people who I think might be listening to this. And what I ended up choosing of his is volume 3 of his space trilogy, which is called That Hideous Strength. That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. This has always been my favorite novel. I don't believe it's the best novel ever written, but it is my favorite novel that I've ever read, and I've read it in the neighborhood of 20 or 30 times over the course of the years. And I thought, not only is this a great novel, not only is it a great teaching experience, but it is really, really fitting and appropriate. He says in his introduction that basically this is the fictionalized form of his great work, The Abolition of Man, which is another great one. It's a story built on the ideology that he deals with in The Abolition of Man. And in our day, we are living through this in spades. There's just so much typical Lewisian insight into the mind of men and into our particular culture. That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. Number 5 on the list is Degenerate Moderns. Degenerate Moderns by E. Michael Jones. E. Michael Jones has appeared multiple times in the Curating Your Book Library segments of the Jesus Changes Everything podcast. Not too long ago, he was a guest of Douglas Wilson on one of Doug's many forms of teaching on the internet. Jones has served for many, many years as the editor of Culture Wars magazine. He has written, and we've covered his book on music, The Dionysius Rising, his book on horror fiction, Monsters from the Id. Degenerate Moderns, what it does is it looks at so many of the men and women who have shaped our modern culture, and looks at the ideologies that they espoused and their own particular life histories, and he connects these dots that are just astonishing to walk. As I always describe reading E. Michael Jones, it's like watching Romans 1 come to life. You're realizing that these ideologies that are shaping our world did not come out of a vacuum, did not come out of a dispassionate pursuit of truth, but came out of the desperate attempt to hide from the fact that we stand guilty before the living God. And Degenerate Moderns is just like a taste from this guy, and a taste from that guy, and a taste from that guy. It's a great introduction, and hopefully will lead you into reading even more of this good man's work. Very similar book, if you have troubles with E. Michael Jones, is Paul Johnson, the Catholic historian's book, Intellectuals. Very much similar style and approach. Number 6 may be the most controversial book on this list, even more controversial than recommending you read G.K. Chesterton, and that is the book called Primeval Saints. Primeval Saints. It's a small book. It's not a well-known book, but I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book in helping us see Jesus in the Old Testament, helping us see who Jesus is, what he's called to do, unpacking that. What I've done in several different Bible studies, including our most recent one, the second Eve, was built on the idea of Jesus being the second Adam. Well, here's where the controversy comes. The book's written by James Jordan. Now, James Jordan has been over the years a friend of mine, who, in my judgment, was actually the grandfather or the father of the Federal Vision movement. I think he took a very bad turn in his thought, and I think he was prone to that. He's one of these guys. He's still alive. He's one of these guys who has these moments of great insight that are so very helpful to us, but he's not willing to be constrained by what I would call historical orthodoxy. Now, I'm not saying he's a heretic at all. I'm saying that his pursuit of these insights sometimes leads him to violate principles that I think are vital to our systematic theology. So don't hear me saying there's no bones to spit out in this book, but there's a lot of wonderful meat. It should sort of enlighten or enliven your understanding of the Old Testament and even your reading of the whole of Scripture. It's an example of insightful biblical theology, sometimes overly speculative, yes, but nevertheless insightful biblical theology, and I commend it to you. Primeval Saints, written by James Jordan. Now, we've got 4 more left to go to balance out the risky recommendation of reading James Jordan. Let me next turn to recommend to you The Death of Death in the Death of Christ. The Death of Death and the Death of Christ is one of the great classic works by John Owen, doing a just unrefutable defense of the doctrine of limited atonement, but doing so in a way that's not just abstract and cold and calculated. This is a celebration of the fullness of the work of Christ for us. The defense itself is built out of the high priestly prayer of Jesus in John's Gospel. And there's not very many places in the Bible that would be better than to just delve and dive into than that prayer of Jesus before he goes to the cross. And so just an outstanding book, The Death of Death and the Death of Christ. It is one of the great classics, certainly would be considered one of the top 10 books in the history of Reformed thinking. And so I commend it to you, The Death of Death in the Death of Christ. Now, speaking of Reformed thinkers, I want to commend to you as well very highly respected Reformed theologian who worked in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century by the name of R.C. Sproul. And I'm not going to commend to you The Holiness of God because I'm going to assume you've already read it. I'm not going to commend to you Chosen by God because I'm going to assume you already read that. What I want to commend to you is a smaller book of his, recently reprinted, called If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists?, which I have covered in this segment. And one of the things that I said that I delight about it, because this is one of his first 3 or 4 books, is you can see a couple of different books, the apologetics thinking and the holiness of God thought processes. You can see them maturing and growing and sprouting, if you will, in this very early book. But quite apart from that, it's just a very, very helpful and good book and puts us on the right footing with respect to our apologetics, not in terms of, whether presuppositionalism is right or evidentialism or the classical view. That's not the point. The point is it tells us, it reminds us in a way that transcends those differences, what it is we're dealing with. What he does in this book is he takes the ideologies of the world that are bent on a kind of Bulverism where, Freud says, well, you just believe in God because it helps you deal with that. Or Marx says, you just believe in God because it helps you deal with this other thing. And he turns it around and says, the reason you don't believe in God is because it helps you deal with this. And the reason you don't believe in God is because it helps you deal with that. It's short, it's brief, it's well written. Check it out. If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? Number 9 on our list, After Darkness, Light. After Darkness, Light. This is a book put together to honor R.C. Sproul on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the publication of his first book and presented to him at a Ligonier conference. It consists of 11 chapters, 10 of which are written by individual either peers of my father or students of my father, each one approaching and defending either one of the solas of the Reformation or one of the 5 points of Calvinism. And it's got John MacArthur, it's got Keith Matheson, all sorts of good men doing those 10 chapters on the solas and the 5 points. Then the 11th chapter is a brief biographical sketch of my father. I was blessed to write that chapter as well as the Soli Deo Gloria chapter and to serve as the editor for that project. It is a great introduction to the Reformed faith, and if you're already embracing the Reformed faith, it's a great encouragement, reminder, and defense. So I commend that to you as number 9. Number 10, well, I'm getting even closer to home here. Number 10, I want to encourage you to read Call Me Barabbas. This is the new book that I've co-authored with my friend Paul Derry that tells more of his story, but some of my story. But all along the way, as we intended from the beginning, it's a book that covers the story of God's grace in our lives, looking at how our lives reflect the life of Barabbas and how Christ has worked in our lives as he worked in the life of Barabbas. It's called Call Me Barabbas, and I would encourage you to read it this year. So that's my list right there for this year. 10 books I commend to you. And by the way, I'll be back every week with another book to recommend for you. Almost certainly. That's my plan. But for now, this is 10 for you to just think about. I know you've just had Christmas. Maybe when you go return the things you don't want, you can take that money and get you these books. Or maybe you could spend your stimulus money on, I don't know. But check out these books. Again, very quickly, A Christian View of Man and Things by Gordon Clark, The Whole Christ by Sinclair Ferguson, Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, Degenerate Moderns by E. Michael Jones, Primeval Saints by James Jordan, Death of Death and the Death of Christ by John Owen, If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists by R.C. Sproul, After Darkness Light, edited by R.C. Sproul Jr., and Call Me Barabbas, written by Paul Derry and R.C. Sproul Jr. Those are some good books. As always, we love to hear from you. If you've read any of these, if you do read any of these, let us know what you thought. If you think some of these don't belong, I'm happy to have that conversation. We just want to hear from you. Thanks so much. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.